She was just a secretary. He was a millionaire CEO. Their worlds should never have collided. But one broken elevator and one unexpected kiss changed everything. Clara Whitmore spent years living in the background, tidy, silent, reliable. She knew how to file papers, schedule meetings, and smile at the right moments. What she didn't know was how to be loved. Not really. Garrett Hale had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly stayed. People admired him, feared him, but no one ever asked what hurt him. Until her. So, when she kissed him just to shut him up, why did it break him instead? And when he asked her to pretend to be his girlfriend, why did her heart start believing it was real? Can a woman with a wounded heart learn to trust again? Can a man who controls everything learn to let go? And most of all, what happens when silence becomes the loudest kind of love? If you're ready for a story that will break your heart and put it back together, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let's begin. The elevator came to an abrupt stop between the 23rd and 24th floors. It wasn't a violent jolt, just a quiet, decisive halt, like the building had exhaled and decided to hold its breath. A soft, mechanical hum faded into silence. Clara Whitmore shifted her weight slightly in her low-heeled boots, instinctively reaching out to the brushed steel panel. Her gloved fingertips hovered over the emergency button, but didn't press it yet. She wasn't alone. Standing 3 feet away, though, it somehow felt closer, was Garrett Hale, CEO of Hale & Co., a man who carried control around like an expensive briefcase, tall, crisp, and too cleanly cut for this early in the morning. His charcoal wool coat still held the faintest trace of snow near the collar, and his jaw was already tight with purpose. He was speaking. Of course he was. The Ridgeway deal won't wait for zoning revisions. I want that settled before end of week, he said, eyes trained on the flickering elevator display, as if sheer willpower might force it to move. We'll need the new layouts for the Boston site by tomorrow. Jeremy is dragging his feet again. His voice echoed slightly in the small space. Not loud, but constant, sharp, polished, practiced. Clara had been hearing it for nearly 7 years now on conference calls, across glass-walled meeting rooms, beside her during cross-country flights. The voice never wavered. It never hesitated. It never paused long enough to let something as trivial as silence settle in. She took a breath. The faint scent of his cologne, something clean and masculine, like cedar wood with a hint of vetiver, lingered in the air. Familiar. In an intrusive kind of way. The elevator was too warm for her coat, but she didn't move. Her planner was tucked under one arm. A coffee stain, barely visible, sat on the corner of one page from earlier that morning. Garrett continued. Also, cancel the standing lunch with the Myers firm. They're not aligned with our pace. Clara glanced at him. He wasn't even looking her way. Her heart beat steadily, but her mind spun. They were stuck, likely only for a few minutes. Nothing dramatic. But in that capsule of steel and awkward proximity, the moment stretched. She could feel her breath now, her hands, the small pull of her shoulder where she always carried too much tension. And still, he kept talking about zoning, about market shares, about people who didn't return his emails within 10 minutes. He was filling the air with urgency and precision like always, wielding words like tools to construct distance. Her lips parted, but not for speech. She didn't know what made her do it. Maybe it was the mounting pressure of years spent being composed, dependable, invisible. Maybe it was the faint hum in the walls, the quiet space between seconds where impulse lived. Or maybe she just wanted him to stop talking. So she kissed him, soft, brief, quiet, not the kind of kiss meant to ignite anything, but the kind that said, in no uncertain terms, hush. She felt the brush of his lips beneath hers, still mid-sentence. The surprise in his posture, the stillness that followed. When she pulled back, Garrett Hale wasn't speaking anymore. He was staring, not coldly, not even angrily, just stunned. His eyes searched hers with a kind of depth that made Clara want to look away, but she didn't. Couldn't. The silence now felt heavier than any word he might have spoken. Clara stepped back, heart hammering. Her hands itched with the urge to adjust something, her scarf, her sleeve, anything to undo what she'd just done. Her cheeks burned. She thought about apologizing, then immediately rejected the idea. Apologizing would make it worse, would make it real. The elevator creaked softly. A hum returned to the walls. Without warning, it resumed its descent, slow but steady. The red LED numbers began their backward march. 23, 22. Neither of them spoke. Clara's mouth felt dry. She gripped the edge of her planner with both hands now. Garrett had turned slightly away, arms folded, eyes focused on the door like it held all the answers he didn't want to ask. She couldn't read him. He wasn't smoothing his tie or adjusting his watch. His breathing was calm, too calm. By the time they reached the ground floor, Clara wasn't sure whether she'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe she'd leaned in too far. Maybe he'd misunderstood. But when the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, he moved first. He stepped into the marble-floored lobby, shoulders straight, strides smooth. She followed. The buzz of the office filled her ears, heels clicking. The soft ding of incoming emails, the hiss of espresso machines at the in-house cafe. The world resumed, indifferent to whatever moment had just happened inside that silver box. Garrett didn't look back. He walked straight toward the security desk, nodded at the receptionist, then paused, just for a second. He turned his head slightly, voice low but clear. "Clara, my office, 10 o'clock," and then he walked away. Clara stood rooted to the spot, feeling the pulse in her throat and the strange quiet settling inside her chest. She wasn't sure what was coming next, but she was certain of one thing. That kiss had silenced more than just his voice. That kiss didn't just silence him. It gave him an idea. Clara had spent most of the night questioning her sanity, replaying every second in that elevator, every breathless moment after. But by morning, the silence between them felt more fragile than comforting. When her phone buzzed with a calendar notification titled "Private Briefing, 10:00 a.m., Conference Room C," she knew something was coming. Garrett never used that room. Not unless he wanted a conversation away from the polished walls of his office or the ever-listening ears of the executive floor. Clara arrived early. The conference room was cold. Gray light spilled through the frosted glass windows, casting long shadows on the sleek table. She kept her coat on, arms folded, fingers tapping softly against the leather edge of her planner. The door opened exactly at 10. Garrett entered with the quiet assurance of someone who owned the building beneath his feet. He didn't sit. He stood across from her, a few feet of silence yawning between them, hands in the pockets of his navy coat. "I have a proposal," he said. Clara blinked, regarding what Garrett's gaze didn't waver. "Us." The word hit like cold water. Clara straightened, her posture sharpening. "There is no us." He nodded, as if acknowledging her protest in theory, but not in practice. "Exactly. Which is why I need you to pretend." She narrowed her eyes. "Pretend what a relationship," he said, as simply as one might order lunch. She laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the idea was so absurd. It briefly short-circuited her usual self-restraint. "You want me to fake date you?" Garrett didn't flinch. "For 1 week, appearances, a few events. My team's under pressure from the press after last quarter's investor shakeup. They're sniffing around for drama. If they think I've softened, settled down, even briefly, it redirects the story. And I'm your safest decoy," she said flatly. He nodded once. "You're trusted, respected, you know my schedule, and frankly, Clara, you're the only person I can tolerate that long." She stood slowly, biting the inside of her cheek. "If you're joking, it's in poor taste. If you're serious, it's worse." "It's strategic," he replied. "A handful of dinners, the gala tonight, 1 weekend out of town, minimal public appearances, mostly photographs. Nothing invasive?" She stared at him, heat rising in her chest. Not anger, not exactly. Something closer to disbelief. "You kissed me," she said softly. And now you want me to turn it into a press-friendly charade." His expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. "You kissed me?" Silence. Clara turned toward the window. Snow had begun to fall again, soft flakes brushing against the glass like memories that wouldn't settle. "What if I say no?" Garrett's voice was steady. "Then I'll find someone else. But she won't know the schedule. Or the company, or me, which would be a liability and a shame." She looked back at him. The shame wasn't in being replaced. It was in being forgettable. "I suppose you've already prepared a contract," she said dryly. Garrett reached into his coat and slid a folded document across the table. She didn't open it. "Just 1 week," she asked. 1 week, he confirmed. No strings, no expectations. Clara's breath caught on the phrase. No expectations, the phrase men used when they wanted the benefits of intimacy without any of the risks. She picked up the paper, scanned it. Neat, clinical, precise, just like him. Her signature felt like surrender. But she signed anyway. The gala was that evening. She dressed at home, alone, in a navy dress she hadn't worn in 5 years. It was modest, classic, and slightly too tight at the ribs. She'd bought it for a wedding that never happened. At 6:30 sharp, a black car arrived. Garrett was inside, already sipping still water from a glass bottle, reading something on his tablet. He looked up when she stepped in, but said nothing. The car was silent all the way to the ballroom. Inside the event, the room shimmered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, men in tuxedos with teeth too white, women in gowns like liquid metal. Clara had never felt more out of place. Garrett placed a hand lightly on her back, not possessive, just guiding. They walked past executives and politicians, names she'd only seen in headlines. Garrett nodded at them like passing acquaintances, but Clara could feel at the weight of their eyes. She smiled. She nodded. She sipped champagne slowly and tried not to stand with her arms crossed. He didn't leave her side, at least not until the mayor's assistant pulled him into a brief conversation. Clara drifted toward the edge of the room, standing near a towering floral display, pretending to admire the orchids. A woman with red lipstick and sharp eyes approached. "You're Garrett Hale's latest, aren't you?" Clara turned, offering a polite smile. "Just a date." The woman laughed, but it wasn't friendly. "They're never just that, not with him." Before Clara could respond, Garrett reappeared, placing a gentle hand on her arm. "Everything all right?" The woman raised an eyebrow. "Oh, she's doing fine, for now." Garrett didn't reply. He simply stepped closer to Clara, his presence quiet but firm, and the woman walked away. They stood in silence for a while, just watching the swirl of wealth and performance. Then Garrett leaned in, low, soft, measured. "You don't need to pretend," he murmured. "You're doing just fine." Clara didn't answer. Her chest felt tight, not from the corset lining of her dress, but from something far older, something she had trained herself to bury. When the evening ended, they rode back in silence. The streetlights flickered against the snow-covered city. Garrett's hand rested near hers on the leather seat. He didn't touch her, but she felt it anyway. A presence, a possibility. For the first time in 10 years, Clara felt something stir in her chest, and it scared her. She still kept the letter in her coat pocket, folded carefully, worn at the edges, a small, quiet weight she carried everywhere, especially on cold days like this. The words were printed in neat, impersonal font, just a few lines. Unsigned. But she'd always known who it was from. The man who left her 5 winters ago, after the ultrasound showed no heartbeat, after weeks of silence, after he decided she was no longer the version of a woman he wanted. "You're wonderful, Clara, just not what I imagined for my future." The letter never said the word loss. It never acknowledged the baby, just her insufficiency. She didn't carry it to torture herself, at least, not intentionally. It was a reminder of the line between hope and delusion, of how quickly something tender could become disposable. She kept it because forgetting felt like permission to let it happen again. That morning, she wore her long beige wool coat, the one with deep inside pockets, and slipped the letter in, like always. Some habits were armor. She'd barely spoken to Garrett all day. Their little performance at the Gala had created just enough of a stir online to validate his plan. Her inbox had lit up with questions from other assistants. "Are you really dating him? How did it start?" She answered none of them. At 6:15 p.m., Garrett appeared beside her desk. "Dinner." She looked up, surprised. "We have another event." "No," he said, "just dinner. We should be seen. Publicly, casually." The word casually made her chest tighten, but she nodded anyway. He took her to a quiet diner tucked between two parking garages on the near north side, a place with cracked red booths and a chalkboard menu that hadn't been updated since before the pandemic. The kind of place no one in Garrett's world would expect him to enter, let alone enjoy. She watched him as they sat down. He didn't reach for his phone, didn't pull out his tablet, just opened the menu and studied it like it held stock prices. Clara ordered meatloaf. He chose a turkey sandwich, no wine, no sparkling water, just plain coffee, black, poured from a pot by a tired-looking server named Maggie. Rain tapped softly against the fogged windows. Outside, headlights swam in slow motion through the mist. Inside, the diner glowed with the warm hush of quiet conversations and clinking silverware. Clara's coat was draped over the booth beside her. She didn't notice when the folded letter slipped from the pocket, but Garrett did. He didn't unfold it, didn't even touch it, just glanced at the white edge peeking out and then back at her. Something softened in his posture, almost like a pause in thought, but he said nothing. Clara talked about the weather. The renovations happening 2 floors below the executive suite. Nothing personal, nothing real. He listened. She didn't expect that. Not the silence, but the listening. Garrett Hale, who always filled space with plans and precision, now sat across from her with a stillness that felt unpracticed. Then he spoke. "My father used to disappear," he said, voice low, eyes on his coffee. Not literally, but in ways that mattered. Clara looked up, unsure if he was talking to her or just saying something he hadn't said aloud in years. He'd go on long business trips. Garrett continued, but even when he was home, he wasn't. He'd sit at the kitchen table and read financial reports instead of asking how school was. When my mother got sick, he stayed late at the office, said he didn't want to bring worry into the house. He stirred his coffee, though it didn't need stirring. I learned early how to make myself small, efficient, useful. Clara didn't speak. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she sensed that this was a rare opening, a delicate thread being offered, not demanded. "He died 2 years ago," Garrett added. "I delivered the eulogy, said all the right things. But I couldn't think of a single story that didn't feel distant." The rain outside picked up, pattering in gentle waves against the glass. Clara thought of her own memories of ultrasound screens and quiet hospital rooms, of holding her grandmother's hand while her world fell apart, of silent Sundays folding laundry with no one to help. She glanced down. The letter had fallen between the cushions. She reached for it, sliding it back into her coat without comment. Garrett didn't ask. He just watched her hands. Their food arrived. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Not tense silence, just mutual space. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled, not the press smile, not the smirk he used when negotiating contracts, but a real worn-in, slightly uneven smile that made him look less like a headline and more like a man. "This place reminds me of a diner near my college dorm," he said. "Bad meatloaf, worse coffee. But they had the best pie." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You ate diner pie weekly," he replied, usually after screwing up a midterm. She didn't know what made her do it, but she smiled back. Just a little. They weren't lovers, not even friends. But tonight, the silence between them felt almost gentle. He scheduled everything. Meetings, workouts, annual physicals, quarterly retreats. Even his grief had a time slot, Clara suspected. But what surprised her most was the way Garrett Hale tried to schedule feelings, as if heartbreak or tenderness could be slotted neatly between investor calls. When he suggested they go to Boston, she assumed it was for business. Until he said, "You'll meet my mother," 3 words, no explanation. He said it as if it were nothing. As if meeting the woman who raised or perhaps refined Garrett Hale was a logical step in their little performance. She's traditional, he added, almost as an afterthought. Clara stared at him across the office. "You mean judgmental?" He didn't argue. The private plane was quiet, the kind of silence padded by luxury, leather seats, soft lighting, the gentle hum of altitude. Clara sat by the window, a mug of green tea warm between her palms. Outside, clouds passed in slow, lazy rolls. Inside, Garrett read something on a sleek tablet until, finally, he set it aside. He looked at her. "What was your childhood like?" he asked, not as small talk, but like a genuine curiosity had landed unexpectedly. Clara blinked. No one had asked her that in years. "Simple," she said after a moment. "Quiet. I grew up in Glenbrook, Colorado, little town near the mountains. My grandmother raised me after my mom passed. She ran a used bookstore out of our front porch." Garrett tilted his head slightly, the faintest crease between his brows. A bookstore. "She read to me every night, apple trees out back too. Autumn smelled like pages and cinnamon." She didn't mean to smile, but the memory softened her voice. Garrett looked away for a second, not dismissively, more like he needed to recalibrate. "I went to boarding school when I was 7, he said. Clara's smile faded. He continued, tone even. "My parents traveled a lot. My father said it was important I learn independence early. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was thick with understanding. No wonder he scheduled his feelings. They had to be summoned, like appointments. No wonder she hoarded hers, like heirlooms wrapped in old cloth. His mother's house was a vision of control, a Georgian estate nestled in the edges of Boston's wealthiest suburb. High ceilings, cream walls, fresh orchids placed with surgical precision, not a speck of dust, not a cushion out of place. Elaine Hale greeted them in a cashmere cardigan and a gaze that felt like cold breath on glass. "So, this is Clara," she said, as if the name were a foreign flavor on her tongue. Clara extended a hand. The handshake she received was precise, brief, and cool. Dinner was served at 7 sharp. The dining room was long and formal, with silverware that could probably buy a small car. Clara sat beside Garrett, posture straight, heart tight, across the table. Elaine asked questions with the politeness of a queen, each one sharp enough to draw blood if answered wrong. "And you've worked with my son for how long? 7 years? And now you're more than just colleagues." Clara hesitated. "It's new." Elaine smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Garrett's always been fond of projects. Something in Clara's chest tightened. She didn't respond. Garrett's eyes flicked toward her. Not a rescue, not yet just awareness. He reached for his water, fingers brushing hers in a way that felt half-intentional. Elaine's attention shifted. "Clara, do you enjoy the company of powerful men?" The room went quiet. Clara looked at Garrett. He was looking at his mother. And for the first time, Clara saw it not arrogance, but restraint. A boy taught not to flinch, even when the knife came from home. "She's not like the others," he said. It came out low, firm, not performative. Elaine didn't reply. She simply lifted her wine glass, as if it were all too boring to challenge. After dinner, Garrett walked Clara out onto the balcony. The air was sharp with late winter chill. City lights flickered beyond the manicured lawn. Clara pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders. He leaned on the railing, gaze fixed somewhere distant. "I wasn't trying to impress her," Clara said quietly. "I know. I didn't even want to come." He turned to her. "I know. But you said it anyway," she added. "About me not being like the others." He didn't respond. The silence settled between them, heavier now, not gentle, like the one at the diner. This one asked something, demanded something. Clara looked down at her hands. She wasn't sure what hurt more, his mother's gaze, or how much she wanted him to mean what he said. He kissed her, not in a ballroom, not in front of cameras, not with any script or schedule in place. It was after dinner, in the still hallway of a quiet Boston hotel, just the two of them. No staff, no flash, no performance. The carpet muffled every footstep. The wallpaper was a muted cream, with tiny vines winding like secrets across the walls. Garrett had walked her to her room, hands in his coat pockets, expression unreadable. The door clicked open behind her, and she was halfway through saying something forgettable, something about early flights when he leaned in. No warning, no hesitation, just warmth. His lips met hers softly, carefully, like he wasn't sure the moment would hold. Not forceful, not desperate, just deliberate, like he was tasting something he'd been curious about for a very long time. Clara didn't push him away, but she didn't respond, either. She stood still. Breath paused, heart not yet decided. When he pulled back, his eyes searched hers for something reaction. Welcome, even rejection. Instead, she stepped backward, her hand brushing the edge of the door. "Don't make this harder," she whispered. 3 words, barely audible, but enough. Garrett stared at her, quiet as snowfall. Then slowly, he nodded, "Then let me try," he said, "to make it right." The next morning, he canceled his breakfast with a regional investor. He didn't say why. Clara overheard his assistant rescheduling 2 calls and a board lunch. She didn't ask. But that afternoon, instead of returning to the executive suite, he appeared beside her desk with 2 paper bags and said, "There's a bench outside. Let's eat." The park was barely a block away, tucked between 2 high-rises. It wasn't much, a few trees, a statue no one remembered, pigeons pecking at crumbs. They sat on a stone bench, side by side, eating sandwiches in the sharp breeze. Garrett didn't check his phone once. At first, Clara thought it was a calculated move, a continuation of the show. But then he said, "I used to think time was the rarest currency, but I've never regretted an hour spent with you." She didn't answer, not because she didn't feel something, but because feelings were dangerous when spoken too soon, especially with men like him. That week, the pattern shifted. Garrett moved meetings, declined black tie invitations. He started showing up in unexpected places by her side at the elevator, waiting in the break room with her favorite tea, pausing in hallways just to ask how she slept. And he stopped calling her efficient. Instead, he called her interesting. And sometimes when he forgot to guard himself, brave. Clara noticed it all, every change, and that terrified her more than if nothing had changed at all, because it meant he was trying, not because the contract demanded it, not because the cameras were watching, but because he wanted to, and she didn't know what to do with that kind of want. One night, they sat on her small apartment couch. It wasn't a date, not officially. He'd dropped her off after a work dinner, and she'd offered him a cup of tea before he left. He accepted. It was the smallest yes. The lamp cast a soft golden pool of light. Her cat, Muffin, had curled up at Garrett's feet as if he belonged there. The room smelled faintly of bergamot and old books. They didn't touch, not even accidentally. He asked about her favorite poems. She asked about his first job. They laughed once softly at a memory involving a broken vending machine and a very soggy suit. And then, silence returned. But it was no longer awkward. It had texture now, like shared history. Clara glanced at him. He looked tired, not in a way that made her worry, but in a way that made her understand just how much effort he was putting in. Not effort to impress, effort to be known. And that was the most frightening part. Because when you're used to being overlooked, someone seeing you can feel like standing in the sun too long, too warm, too bright, too much. Clara didn't know if she could believe him, not yet, not completely, but something in her had started to listen, something softer than fear, something older than doubt. He said it wasn't serious, but to her, it had already become everything. It was just another Tuesday, the kind that rolled quietly through the office like fog. Clara had been typing notes from a morning briefing when Michelle, a soft-spoken woman from the PR team, tapped gently on her desk. "There's something you should hear," Michelle said, hesitant. "I probably shouldn't," but she handed Clara a small recorder anyway, with a single file open and ready to play. The soft glow of the screen showed the date and time just yesterday afternoon. It was an interview. Garrett's voice, smooth, polished, unshakable. The reporter asked something light, offhanded. "So, Garrett, the woman, everyone's talking about Clara Whitmore. Is she the real deal?" A pause, then Garrett's voice, crisp and clear. "Clara, she's convenient. I trust her, but it's not serious. Just 6 words. Nothing scandalous, no malice, just cold, measured detachment. But to Clara, they detonated something buried deep. Not because he'd lied, not because he'd played her, but because she'd heard those exact words before from someone else. Years ago, different voice, same indifference. The man who left her in a hospital hallway and never returned. You're wonderful, Clara, but you're not what I imagined for my future." She barely realized the recorder had slipped from her hand onto the desk. For 5 full minutes, she sat there. No tears, no outburst. Just the slow collapse of something she'd let herself believe might be different. She looked around the office, her desk, the bookshelf with its uneven stack of folders, the mug Garrett had once brought her from a conference in Denver, a paperweight shaped like an apple, a nod to her childhood. All of it, quietly echoing years of effort and invisible loyalty. And just like that, it no longer felt like hers. She stood up, heart thudding, not with rage, but with something deeper. Disappointment. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that simply walks away. She packed slowly. Not because she had much, just a few notebooks, a photo of her and her grandmother, and a small plant with a stubborn second stem that refused to bloom. She placed each item into her leather tote, fingers lingering for a moment on the worn armrest of her chair. She remembered late nights here, empty hallways, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, the sound of her typing echoing in the silence. She'd built a kind of life here, not loud, not glamorous, but honest. Her resignation letter had already been printed. She signed it in pen, no digital copy, no email, just ink on paper like the kind of goodbye that still mattered. And then, on a blank sheet, she wrote something else. Not long, just 1 line. "I was never pretending. That's the difference." She folded it once, slipped it under the coaster on Garrett's desk. No envelope, no signature, just truth. At 4:37 p.m., she walked out of the building. No one noticed. The lobby was its usual blur of muted phone calls and clicking heels. She passed through it like a shadow, slipping between the cracks of someone else's routine. Outside, the wind had picked up, a dry cold that stung her cheeks and made the city lights blur just a little. But she didn't stop. She didn't look back. Garrett returned to the office at 5:12 p.m., having just concluded a late client lunch. He loosened his tie as he stepped in, already listing a dozen things in his head: calls to return, files to review, meetings to rearrange. He reached for the glass of water on his desk and saw the folded paper. No envelope, just her handwriting. He opened it, read it once, then again and again. He looked around, the chair where she always sat empty, her desk cleared, the small plant with the stubborn second stem gone. It took him several seconds to understand what had happened, several more to feel it. He missed his next meeting. No one could reach him for almost an hour, not because he was angry, not because he was confused, but because for the first time in years, he was hurt, not professionally, not strategically, just personally, the kind of ache that schedules couldn't fix, the kind that arrived without warning and settled in places no one else could see. She left behind the city lights, the skyline, and him, but some goodbyes don't stay quiet for long. Glenbrook hadn't changed much. The old gas station still had that flickering neon sign that blinked open like it needed convincing. The post office smelled like worn paper and peppermint. The mountain air was crisp and dry, laced with the scent of pine and melting snow. And the bookstore, her mother's bookstore, sat right where it always had, tucked between a bakery and the hardware store, its faded green awning swaying gently in the wind. Clara stepped inside on her second morning back. The doorbell chimed the same way it had 25 years ago, when her grandmother would open shop just as the sun crept up over the hills. The wood floors creaked in familiar patterns. Dust floated in the shafts of morning light that poured through the front windows. The shelves were just as she remembered, crooked in places, overloaded in others, but full of quiet stories that had been waiting for her all this time. It smelled like paper and old pine wood and the faint ghost of cinnamon, like memory itself. Helen, her grandmother, still ran the place. Not officially. Her knees weren't what they used to be, but her mind was sharp and her spirit stubborn. She insisted on handling the register every morning, and organizing the front display by theme books for sad souls was this week's category. Clara didn't ask if that was a coincidence. She threw herself into the rhythm of the store, sweeping, sorting, relabeling sections, cataloging old donations, fixing the thermostat that clicked too loud in the afternoons. Anything to stay busy, anything to outrun the echo of his voice in that interview. Every night. She wrote letters she never sent. Short ones, long ones, some angry, some aching, folded and tucked away in the drawer of her nightstand like pressed flowers. She'd start with Garrett and end with nothing. Sometimes she stared at her phone long enough that the screen dimmed. Once, she even typed his number halfway before locking it again. She didn't cry, but every time someone mentioned Chicago, she found herself looking out the window just a moment too long. Spring came slow in Glenbrook. Snow melted in lazy patches. The apple trees out back were still bare, but their branches quivered with the promise of bloom. The birds returned in quiet pairs. The bookstore got a little busier, locals preparing for the summer tourists, students searching for old classics to write papers on. Clara smiled more, laughed even, when Helen made jokes about forgetting where she put her glasses again. But it wasn't joy, not really. It was survival, a kind of stillness that wasn't peace, just quiet. One afternoon, Helen made tea and insisted they sit outside on the porch behind the shop. The sun was out, warming the worn wooden steps. Clara curled her fingers around a chipped floral mug, letting the steam soften her face. Helen rocked gently in her chair. She watched her granddaughter for a long while before speaking. "You know," she said softly, "when your mother left you with me, I didn't ask questions. I just held you and let you be quiet." Clara nodded. "But you weren't quiet forever." Helen continued. "Eventually, you started humming, then reading aloud, then asking impossible questions about how stars are born." Clara smiled faintly. "I was annoying." "You were healing," Helen corrected. "And now I see the same quiet in you again." Clara looked down at her mug. "It's not the same. No," Helen agreed. "This time, it's not about losing something." Clara looked up. Helen's eyes were soft, but direct. "It's about leaving something that mattered." The breeze rustled the pages of a forgotten book on the table. Clara didn't speak. Helen leaned closer. "If it was all pretend, Clara, you wouldn't be this hurt. If he never meant anything, you wouldn't be carrying this silence like a second skin." Clara swallowed. Helen reached out, her weathered hand closing gently over Clara's. "You left the city. Yes, but you didn't leave him. Not really. Not here." She tapped lightly over Clara's heart. That night, Clara stood alone in the back room of the bookstore, long after closing. The lights were dim, the silence thick. Outside, a light snow had begun to fall again, unseasonal, but gentle. She ran her hand along the spines of books she'd shelved 100 times. Books about second chances, lost things, letters never sent. She paused at a window, looked out at the empty street. She was safe here. She was known here, but she wasn't whole. And somehow, that mattered more now than it ever had. Garrett hadn't spoken to his mother in weeks. Not since Boston. Not since Clara. But losing her had done what years of silence couldn't. It was a Tuesday evening when he rang the buzzer at Elaine Hale's brownstone, the same townhouse where he'd spent teenage summers learning posture, piano, and how to hide his softness. She answered the door wearing pearls and pressed linen, her expression unreadable as always. "Garrett," she said, as though his presence were scheduled. "Come in." Dinner was roast chicken and asparagus, white plates, silver cutlery, no music, no chatter, just the quiet clink of forks and knives and the sound of Garrett's heartbeat thudding somewhere in the hollow of his ribs. They ate mostly in silence. Elaine sipped her wine like punctuation. Garrett picked at his food. The same chair he'd sat in as a boy felt both familiar and foreign now, like wearing a jacket that once fit but no longer belonged. When she finally spoke, her voice was even. "She left. Didn't she?" He looked up. Elaine didn't meet his eyes, just swirled her wine gently, as if it held answers. "She was never part of the plan," he replied, not bitter, just tired. Elaine gave a short, knowing smile. "Neither was your father." The words hung in the air like dust. For the first time, Garrett saw something fragile flicker in her expression, not softness. Elaine Hale did not do softness, but maybe something close to regret. "I was going to marry someone else," she said, voice low. "He was warm, laughed too easily, wrote me letters on hotel stationery when he traveled." Garrett blinked. He had never heard her speak like this, but he didn't come with a legacy. She continued, "No board seat waiting, no estate, just love, and a dream of opening a vineyard in Sonoma." She laughed once, quiet and bitter. "I chose your father instead, because it made sense, because I thought I could teach myself how to be content with structure." Garrett felt something twist inside him. "You never told me this," he said. "There was no room for it," she replied. "Just like there's never been room in your life for anything, unplanned." They sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that used to feel obedient. Now it felt suffocating. Elaine stood, slowly, and brought a second glass of wine to the table. She poured for both of them. For a moment, she looked not like the woman who'd raised him with rigid grace, but like someone older, someone tired. "You're not your father, Garrett," she said. He closed his eyes. "I never wanted to be like him," he said, barely above a whisper, "but I became worse." Elaine looked at him, then really looked, and something shifted in her posture. "You didn't become worse," she said gently. "You became scared." The glass in his hand trembled, and then quietly. Without warning, Garrett Hale cried, not loudly, not with drama, just quiet. Tired tears that traced down his face like he'd been holding them for decades, like each one had been scheduled for a time that never came. Elaine didn't reach for him, didn't speak. She just sat across from him, still and watching, and for once, didn't try to fix it. Garrett wiped his face with the back of his hand, took a deep breath, then another. "I never said it out loud," he murmured. "What?" "That I loved her." Elaine stared at him, her eyes suddenly wet too. "But you do," she said. He nodded, slowly. I started loving her the moment she didn't flinch when I showed her who I really was." Elaine took another sip of wine. "Then, what are you doing here?" It was dark when he stepped outside. No driver, no plan, no destination, just the night, and the echo of a truth he could no longer ignore. He walked 3 blocks before stopping. His phone buzzed with calendar alerts he didn't check, meetings he'd already missed. He opened the contact list, scrolled past names that meant nothing now, and stopped at one. Clara. He didn't have a plan, didn't need one. He wore the wrong shoes for a mountain town. Leather soles, shined to perfection, better suited for boardrooms than sidewalks dusted with pine needles and melting snow. But he didn't care. He wasn't here for comfort. The bus had dropped him off near Glenbrook's old diner. He stood there for a moment, a sharp black silhouette against the muted colors of a quiet town waking up. The mountains curved gently behind the buildings, like watchful elders. The morning air was thin, the sun barely cresting over the ridge. Garrett adjusted his wool coat and started walking. People stared, not rudely, just curiously, like he was a puzzle piece dropped into the wrong box. The barista at the corner cafe tilted her head. The clerk at the hardware store paused mid-conversation. Two old men sitting on a bench outside the feed shop followed him with narrowed eyes. He asked for directions to the bookstore. They pointed, but one of them asked, "You lost?" Son Garrett smiled faintly. "Actually, maybe." The doorbell chimed as he stepped inside the shop. Wooden floors, warm lighting, and the scent-aged pages, pine, a trace of something sweet and spiced. For a moment, he didn't move, just stood there, letting it all settle around him. Then he saw her. At the far end of the store, behind the counter, restocking a shelf of classics, Clara. Her hair was pinned loosely, wisps framing her face. She wore a soft cardigan, sleeves pushed to her elbows. She looked peaceful, until she saw him. For one heartbeat, she froze. Then she turned back to the shelf and continued working. No words, no welcome, just silence. Before he could say anything, someone else stepped in from the back. Helen. Her eyes scanned him like a ledger page taking inventory not of what he wore, but who he had become. They stood a few feet apart, the weight of generations between them. She broke the silence. "I suppose you're here for her." Garrett nodded. Helen didn't smile, didn't frown. She just asked, softly, "Are you willing to stand still and listen?" "Yes," he said. She studied him one moment longer, then stepped aside. "The kettle's always on," she said, and disappeared into the back. He didn't ask for anything, didn't explain. He simply stayed. Each morning, he arrived just after sunrise, sometimes before the lights were even on. He took a stool by the front window and helped sort returned books. When the delivery came in late, he carried the boxes inside. When the heater hiccuped, he fetched tools. He even cleaned the windows. No suit, just rolled up sleeves and quiet hands. And Clara. She said nothing. No thanks, no questions, no eye contact for the first 2 days. But she let him stay, and that was something. The townspeople adjusted slowly. By day 3, the coffee shop girl began offering him a free muffin with his order. By day 4, someone left a flannel blanket folded on the bookstore bench with a note for the city boy. Garrett smiled, but he didn't let it distract him. He was here for one reason. Clara watched him, not directly, but from behind stacks of books, through the reflection in the front glass, or over the top of a clipboard. She watched how he moved slower here, how he no longer looked at his watch, how he learned to brew tea without checking instructions, how he spoke gently to the cat that wandered in each afternoon. But, mostly, she watched how he didn't push. Not once did he try to explain himself. Not once did he say, "Forgive me." He just showed up, in every sense of the word. On the 5th evening, it snowed again. Soft flakes drifted down as the town fell quiet. Garrett stayed after closing, helping Helen straighten a back shelf that hadn't been touched in years. Clara swept the front. Their movements overlapped, but never collided. As Garrett reached for a dusty old copy of Wuthering Heights, he paused. On the inside cover was a note in familiar handwriting, a bit tragic, a bit tender, but always honest. "See." He ran his thumb over the ink, then gently placed it back. The next morning, he arrived to find the kettle already whistling. Clara was behind the counter, and on the table by the window, where he always sat, lay a worn copy of Jane Eyre. The spine cracked gently as he opened it. A single page was marked in blue ink. She had underlined a line near the bottom. "I would always rather be happy than dignified." No note, no explanation. But it was more than enough. It wasn't a love confession. It was a quote. But it said more than any "I'm sorry" could. Garrett sat with the book in his lap, fingers resting gently on the open page. The spine crackled faintly when he'd opened it that morning, like the book itself had been waiting to breathe again. Jane Eyre? He hadn't read it in years. Not since college. Back then, he skimmed through it for an essay, pulling surface-level quotes to sound insightful in a classroom. He hadn't remembered much beyond a few themes about independence and fire. But this page, this line, was different. She had underlined it in soft blue ink, the kind that faded at the edges. Real love doesn't ask you to perform. It asks you to stay. No note, no extra words. Just that. A single truth, dressed in ink. He stared at it for a long time, and then he closed the book and stood. The next morning, Clara noticed he wasn't at the bookstore, nor the morning after that, nor the third day. She didn't ask Helen, didn't call, didn't look for footprints in the snow or check the bakery down the street, but her hands fumbled when she shelved the classics. Her eyes lingered too long on the kettle as it boiled. She didn't say it aloud, but the silence left behind had shape and weight, and maybe that was what scared her most. Because somewhere between the creak of the bookstore floor and the clink of his spoon against porcelain, she had begun to feel something she hadn't let herself feel in years. Not love, not yet, but trust, the beginnings of it, the kind that tiptoes in like spring thaw, slow, quiet, almost unnoticeable until the roots start waking. On the fourth morning, she unlocked the door just past 7. As usual, snow had melted into shallow puddles along the curb. The bell above the door jingled as she pushed it open, the scent of books greeting her like an old friend. She turned on the lights, adjusted the blind, and then paused. There, taped neatly to the inside of the front window, was a flyer, simple black and white, no frills. Just text, centered and clear. An evening of words, a community book reading hosted by Garrett Hale. Tonight at 7 p.m. at Whitmore Books, everyone welcome. She read it twice, then once more. The paper fluttered slightly in the breeze from the heater vent. Like it too was nervous. She didn't touch it, just stared. Helen entered a few minutes later, carrying a basket of muffins from the diner. She saw the flyer, said nothing, only placed a hand on Clara's shoulder as she passed. A soft squeeze, and that was enough. Later that morning, Clara returned to the table by the front window, the same one Garrett had sat at every day for nearly a week. She ran her hand across the wood, stopping where the book still lay right where he had left it. She opened to the page again. The ink looked even softer now, like it had settled deeper into the paper, like it belonged there. The whole town showed up. People came with mittens still damp from snow, cheeks pink from the wind. Folding chairs creaked as neighbors settled in. The front row filled fast, then the second, then standing room only along the back wall and by the windows. But Garrett only looked at one chair, and it stayed empty, until it didn't. The bookstore had never seen this many people at once. Helen dimmed the front lights, leaving just the soft amber glow from the pendant bulbs above. It wrapped the room in warmth, like a blanket pulled over something fragile. Garrett stood at the front, no podium, just a wooden stool, a lamp behind him, and the worn copy of Jane Eyre in his hands. He took a breath, then another. His voice, when it came, was quiet, almost too quiet. He began to read. The words weren't dramatic. There was no performance, no show, just him and the story, and the silence that held them both. The page he chose wasn't the one she had marked, but one that came just after. A passage about fear, about not trusting joy, because you've lost too much. About loving despite it. His voice wavered once, mid-sentence, but he didn't stop, not when someone coughed, not when a baby cried softly in the corner, not even when the front bell chimed gently. Clara stepped inside. She didn't rush forward, didn't take the empty chair in the front row. She stayed near the back, coat still on, arms folded lightly in front of her, and he saw her. But he didn't break stride, just looked at her for a moment and smiled, then kept reading. When he finished, the room held its breath. Then, slowly, softly, people began to clap. Not loud. Just enough. Like they knew too much noise would break whatever this moment had become. Garrett nodded, closed the book, thanked them, then stepped down from the stool. He didn't search the crowd. He didn't have to. She was already walking toward him, each step careful, steady, like crossing ice that might crack. They met in the space between bookshelves. No spotlight, no music, just the murmur of townsfolk gathering their coats, and the smell of old paper and steeping tea. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small, folded cloth. Inside it, a simple gold band, worn smooth with time, not new, not polished. Clara blinked. "That's," she whispered. Garrett nodded. "It's from the armrest of your old chair," he said. "The one you sat in for 7 years." She looked down at it. He didn't kneel, didn't ask, just held it in his open palm, voice low. "If you want to say no, I'll walk away." He swallowed. "But if you want a love that stays, I'm here. No suits, no noise." The room had mostly emptied now. Helen watched from the register. The bell jingled as someone held the door for another. Outside, snow was falling again. Clara didn't say yes. She didn't say anything. She stepped forward, took his face gently in both hands, and kissed him. Again. She never dreamed of marrying a millionaire. That had never been her fantasy. Clara Whitmore had long ago let go of glass slippers and storybook endings, but she had always wanted to be chosen, not for convenience, not for performance, chosen because someone saw her, all of her, and still stayed. It had been a year. The snow had returned to Glenbrook, soft and steady, covering the rooftops and sidewalks like a lullaby. In the mornings, steam rose from chimneys. In the afternoons, the school bell rang through town like a heartbeat, and in the middle of it all stood Whitmore Books, with 2 names now etched in brass above the window. Clara ran the shop the way her mother once had, gently, thoughtfully, without rushing anything or anyone. Children came in after school for story time. Tourists wandered through during the weekends, charmed by the curated staff favorites shelf. Locals brought in cookies or old books for trade. Garrett handled inventory. He alphabetized obsessively, labeled every box with meticulous care. He took to writing short essays that he stapled to the front of the shelves, reflections on grief, memory, second chances. People began coming in just to read them. He still wore wool coats, but now they had smudges of dust from unpacked boxes and ink stains on the sleeves. They had moved into the small apartment above the store. It wasn't big. The pipes groaned in winter, and the bedroom window stuck sometimes. But it had good light, and the kettle boiled fast. There were blankets on every chair, and books stacked in corners, and a quiet rhythm to the way their lives moved now. Garrett, once obsessed with time blocks and alarms, now woke without setting anything. He brewed coffee while Clara fed the cat. She liked her toast barely warm. He burned his every time. They argued about socks left on the stairs, or whether the plant by the window was dying, but they chose each other anyway, every day. One afternoon, Helen came to visit. She sat in her usual spot by the front window, wrapped in a shawl, watching the snow drift past. She sipped her tea and asked, "Do you ever miss Chicago?" Clara thought for a long moment, then said softly, "I miss who I was, before I knew how to love." Helen smiled. "That girl was strong," she said. "She had to be." Clara replied, "But I like this version of me more." They didn't celebrate anniversaries with candlelit dinners. Instead, they had rituals. The first snowfall of the year meant pancakes for dinner, every Sunday afternoon. They closed the store early and walked through the woods behind the school. On full moon nights, they read poetry to each other quietly, without needing to finish the whole page. And when the shop was especially quiet, Clara would sometimes rest her head on Garrett's shoulder, and he'd reach for her hand, and they'd just sit. No plans, no meetings, just breath and warmth and stillness. They still carried pieces of the people they once were. Clara still kept the letter in the back of her drawer, the one that once told her she wasn't enough. She never read it anymore, but she never threw it away. Garrett still checked his calendar every now and then, not because he needed to, but because old habits take time to fade. But those pieces no longer hurt. They had softened, like stones in a river, worn smooth with time and tenderness. That evening, they closed the store early. It was snowing again, thicker this time. Garrett stood by the window, watching the flakes swirl under the lamplight. Clara approached quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. She handed him one. He took it with a soft, "Thank you," their fingers brushing. They stood in silence for a while. Then she said, "You know, that first kiss, in the elevator." He looked at her, smiling. Hard to forget. "I didn't do it to start something," she said. "I just wanted a moment of quiet." Garrett nodded. And now Clara leaned in. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Now I kiss you, because there's too much to say." She kissed him that evening, not to silence him, but because this time she wanted to say everything. In a world that often rewards speed, noise, and appearances, this story quietly reminds us of the power of presence. Clara and Garrett's journey isn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It's about 2 people both carrying their own wounds, learning how to stay. Not because it's easy, but because love worth keeping is love worth choosing, again and again. We are taught to chase success, to stay composed, to move on quickly. But healing often happens in the quiet, in the spaces where someone waits without demanding, where pain is met with patience, and where forgiveness is given not as a reward, but as a gift. This story is a gentle invitation to pause, to listen, to speak less and feel more. And maybe to remember that the strongest kind of love isn't always loud. It's the kind that shows up every morning, brings tea instead of flowers, and stays even when it's hard. So, if you've ever felt like love passed you by, perhaps it's not too late. Not for a new chapter, and not for a love that finally knows how to stay. Thank you for spending your time with us, for listening not just with your ears, but with your heart. If this story touched you in any way, made you feel seen, understood, or simply reminded you of something you once believed in, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to our channel. Every story we share is crafted with care, hoping to bring warmth, healing, and connection. And remember, sometimes the gentlest stories leave the deepest mark.